Hello, and welcome to the Modern Romantic podcast, where we celebrate and inspire romanticism through passionate people doing incredible things. Hi, I'm rolling for initiative. Hi, I'm Trey. See, I lied. I'm sorry, and I do have to apologize immediately to my co-host for telling her I didn't have something planned, but I did. Emily. Hi, Emily.
Hello. I'm gonna have to roll for a perception check to see if I can even hear you or see you or know that you're
How
there.
how dare you?
How dare I?
How dare you?
Sir, I am a paladin.
I am. You know what? I have too many characters mulling around in my brain right now. I don't know which one to pick. But you know who else also has many characters mulling around in his brain?
Oh,
Our
I
guest today.
of course. Of course our guest today. Today we have with us someone who probably owns his own round table. Lev Grossman is with us here today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. Thank
Yeah,
you so
thanks
much
for
for being
coming.
with us.
Mhm. So you are in Australia.
That's correct. I am in Sydney right now, which
And
is
it
where I've been living for a couple of years.
and you are it is so right now as we're recording this live, it's Monday here and Tuesday there.
Yes, I speak to you from the future,
That's wonderful.
and I'm bringing 11 o'clock in the morning energy to your Monday evening.
Well,
Uh,
I'm glad you're able to, and there is a future to look forward to.
I do have to ask, what are the lottery numbers?
We'll take that offline.
Very, very good answer. Very awesome. What do you think has been like the biggest cultural difference for you and for your kids?
That's a good question. Um, uh, I mean, the cultural differences are Mm. They're subtle, and really things vary a lot from the between the different cities in Australia. Um, uh, Sydney is it's not. I shouldn't be living in Sydney. Sydney is not the intellectual or literary city. Sydney is this kind of the beachy slash financial city.
Okay.
Um, but I don't know. Australians they're very open. They're very easy to befriend, which is a nice thing. Coming from New York, which was a much more I don't know intense, closed situation. There's some indefinable quality to just being very far from everything else. The whole world is kind of slightly muted in a pleasant way, or at least pleasant after 20 years in New York. It's wonderful. It's wonderful here. I recommend it to everybody.
It's on my bucket list.
Same, truthfully. But I am torn between either Melbourne or Sydney. Do you have a preference of the two?
Well, I am a Sydney sider, as Sydney residents are called. I love Sydney. As I said, Melbourne is much more. It's much more New Yorky. It's more literary. It's more intense. The weather is worse. The beaches aren't as good. It's where serious people go to get serious work done. And So I feel as though I should prefer Melbourne, but in fact, um, I'm all for Sydney.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to some place that I guess dynamically should speak to you as a person, I guess going to some place that's maybe a little bit different kind of challenges certain perspectives. So maybe offers up something new and fresh and to give inspiration.
It was an opportunity for me to play against character, play against type. And in fact, coming here, one of the reasons I came here is because I was so stuck in my creative work, and I needed some kind of drastic reset to, I don't know, I needed to reboot. And in fact, it turned out to be a great way to do it.
Yeah. Well, I would say so. The whenever I heard that you were coming onto the podcast, truthfully, I was like really excited. I have not finished. I have just started the first book in your Magician's trilogy. But I had watched the show for many years, and so I was really excited that you were coming. But one thing that truly struck me when we were researching you up until this point is that you were both a journalist and then you're also an author. And so for you, I would like to understand where the line for writing about the world in which we live and then taking that and writing these combination of sci-fi, high fantasy with still a lot of very human centric elements to it. How did you, one, make separate spaces for those, and then also bridge the gap between those?
Well, that's a we're diving right into the difficult questions.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry, let me ask you
Wow.
5 questions in a row.
Well, I mean, one thing I like in my one thing I like in my fantasy is a powerful sense of groundedness. I really like that sense that we are in a world that has a history, that has you know, an economy, that has all its working parts in place. So it feels sort of solid and real in that way that Westeros does. Um, and I can tell you what's good practice in world building is writing about actual reality. When you are, when you're writing a magazine piece, the pieces I worked for Time magazine for 19 years, and those pieces were quite short. They had to grab your attention absolutely immediately. They had to include a lot of information in a way that wasn't sort of oppressive or homeworky, and bringing those very practical skills, technical skills almost, to fantasy was, I think it was very helpful to me. One of the big challenges, of course, in building a new world is putting across the information in ways that are sort of subtle and not info dumpy. Um, and that don't lose the reader's attention. And those skills carried across from Time quite a bit. I also, in my earlier part of my creative career, was extremely pretentious, and working for Time really knocked a lot of the pretentiousness out of me, because it was writing for Time was really about communicating with people, putting information across in a very clear way, keeping their attention when they could be doing any one of 1,000 things besides reading your magazine. I really learned to write like a normal person, and that was an amazing education in itself.
I love that answer. Do you I've seen that you've written for a number of different publications. You've talked about Time. Was there one in which that like really stands out to you besides Time?
Um, Gosh, there was some. There was some great. I'm just thinking about some of my great freelance experiences. I wrote. Vanity Fair did a Star Wars cover when the which one was it for? I think it was for the last one of the J.J. Abrams sequel trilogy, and for that, they sort of you spend time with all the cast. You talk to everybody involved in making Star Wars. Your pieces, your words run against incredible glossy pictures by Annie Leibovitz. That was an amazing experience.
Yeah.
But by far most of the work I did for Time was for Time, and that was I really got sent all over the world and met like huge numbers of very important, interesting people who were way smarter than me, and that was kind of a priceless experience. I mean, I can remember, in 1997, the Google guys coming into my office when they were still Stanford graduate students, and trying to pitch me on their idea for a new search engine. which I did not understand even slightly. But it's sort of it's incredible now to think back on that conversation.
Yeah. What? That's a cool piece of history.
Yeah, it's a real missed investment opportunity on my part. Uh, Looking back, I could have played that differently, but here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Not much we can do about it now.
You had said a couple moments ago of like how to write subtle and non-info dumping onto your audience. Um, it's it's interesting that you say it like that because I read so many things that are just nothing but exposition right up front, and they feel all of that is necessary. If you were to give some tips to future writers of how to not be how to be subtle and non-info dumping, what three pieces would you give them?
Well, I'll tell you the answer, even though I feel as though I'm slightly I'm lifting the veil to the really in unglamorous backstage of writing.
It's okay to
I
keep
actually,
things proprietary a little bit.
even though I have used that word minutes ago, I actually don't like the term world building. Um, it's not as though you're building a vast stage set and then you sort of march your characters through it. In my experience, the world exists to serve the story. And so your characters are going through this journey that they have to go through, and they're going through their various psychological and spiritual transformations. And the world is there to assist them, and it enables them at sometimes, and it pushes back against them at other times, or it chimes with something that's going on inside them. So it's actually a much more flexible and polymorphous entity than a sort of static standing stage set. So I tend to world build as I go, rather than doing, for example, the Tolkien thing of writing an entire dictionary of the Elvish language before my elf walks on stage. I will make up things as I go, and hopefully they'll stay more or less consistent. But what they're really doing is they're resonating with what's happening inside the characters, and then when I get to the very end, I then go back and try to normalize everything so that it all makes sense with each other. But I tend not to think about it actually as building a working world until relatively late in the process. And the only other thing about world building is no one character is allowed to say to another character anything that character would already know. So people often, allow characters to say things like each other. Well, living as we do in the United States of America, which has a president in charge who's elected by the people, although there's that electoral college thing, people explain things to each other that they would already know.
Right.
That's the thing I try to avoid above all else. It has to all be storytelling, and anything you can't work in as storytelling, you just are not going to work in.
I like that about your writing. It's something that I notice about other writers sometimes will do that where it feels awkward for a minute that something's being explained to a character that they would probably already know. It's just like you can tell it's there just to inform the audience and it's being forced in, and the way you do it doesn't feel forced. So I like that.
Hopefully not. I'm sure that I have broken that rule on numerous occasions, but it's the one that I try to stick to.
No, it's a wise one. So, I'm sorry. I want to make sure you were done before I.
Oh, sorry, I'm done. Yes,
I apologize.
I've run out of things to say.
I wanted to ask something that I brought up at the beginning of the show, and that was if you owned your own round table, because I feel like that would be like the cool thing nobody knows that you actually have.
That would be a good thing to own. I mean, I've owned some tables that are technically circular in shape, but they're quite small. It's for like a 4-night table, maybe even just a 3-night table. Yeah, I'm not very strong on Arthurian paraphernalia, and I wish that I was. I own a couple of practice swords that I bought for working out some of the sword fighting sequences. But those are probably among the most Arthurian things that I own, which is, now that I say it out loud, a bit of a shame. But here we are.
It's never too late.
It's a, it's never too late. Yes,
Right.
one of these days, you know, Excalibur will turn up on eBay, and I'll
That's
pick it
right.
up,
Or it'll
hopefully cheap.
appear in your life somehow, for sure.
That also could happen. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a cool story as well. Yeah, it's I do photography and I do these kind of over the top kind of fantastical photo shoots, and I always thought having a round table would be a cool um although I'd have to hand build it because you can't just go buy like a real round. I mean, yeah, like you a 3 or 4 night round table, but I'm talking like, a dozen nights round table.
Mm.
And I just finished. Oh, go ahead.
No, but I'm interrupting you. Please go.
No, that's okay. I just finished a photo shoot of a kind of a Renaissance medieval feast, and at the beginning when we were planning it, I was like, "Can we fit a round table in there somehow? How cool would that be?" You don't see any feasts happening on round tables, but the
Mm.
idea of making one was just a little much for this project. So maybe in the future.
It's a high bar, and certainly anybody who's trying to retell the King Arthur story has to wrestle with their own version of the round table, because it is a uniquely impractical shape for a table. If you have a large company of knights, many round table, maybe many versions of Arthur have 100 knights on the table, or 150 knights on the table, and as Merlin points out in the Once Future King, that's a lot of wood. The area of a table large enough to seat that many, it's like bigger than you think.
You're
So I would
shouting.
assume I always assumed that you would have the interior would be you would be a circular table rather than a sort of a solid mass of wood, and there'd be an open interior, and then you'd seat knights around the outside, but then also around the inside. There have been many other approaches to that, and I believe somewhere late in the Bright Sword, somebody complains about the idea of the round table, how it sounds good in theory, but in practice, there is a lot of shouting that goes on.
Yes, that was. There's the please pass the salt or whatever would be a difficult request. You would
Right.
have to send like a
That's where,
messenger.
yeah, no, that's where the groundedness comes in. I feel like everything would have to work. Everything would have to work if you staged it. And round tables, where they are quite challenging. If you had 12 knights, it would be fine.
Yeah,
But for some reason, I felt compelled to do the maxi version of the table, which has 100 knights, and that's a lot of knights.
it is. It is. That sounds like a fascinating challenge, though. Josh said, speaking of, quote, ladies lying around in lakes distributing swords, end quote. So are you saying you're a Monty Python fan?
Yes, I'm a Monty Python fan. When you look at modern versions of King Arthur, there are very few smarter versions than Monty Python and the Holy Grail. They, it's very clear that that there are some serious medieval scholars lurking around in the creation of that screenplay, because it's extremely sharp. And if you want to do something subversive with the Arthur story, it's very hard to find something that they didn't already do.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt that I needed to give them a shout out earlier in the book, which was very divisive among my editors and agents. I was
Oh,
begged by several people not to use the Monty Python quote, because surely I would not be taken seriously as a literary author if I led with the Monty Python quote. I
hmm.
feel even without the Monty Python quote that I am not taken seriously as a literary author. So I had
No.
almost nothing to lose, and many people respond well to it. It is a good quote.
I applaud it. Good decision to keep it in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I will be team Monty Python.
And it does, as with many things in Monty Python, it does make a serious point. The Arthurian kind of when Arthur dies, everything falls apart. There's a massive succession crisis, and it's because the lady doesn't distribute any more swords after Arthur dies, and he has no kids. So in fact, it is a very bad basis for a system of government. And you know, and we see that in the Bright Sword because we look a lot at the chaos that happens after Arthur's death. Um, and you know, it's a succession crisis in the making. And sure enough, that's what happened.
And the story of Arthur has been this whole, from Monty Python to now you, and before and during all this time, has been romanticized many times by many people. And so something must have made you something you must have had a moment where you went, you know, I'm gonna dive into that in a different way. How did you get to that point?
I mean,
I guess sorry.
novels, much like the French Revolution, they have multiple causes that contribute to them. And in my case, I was a devoted Arthur fan to the point where until I was in my 40s, I never really thought about writing Arthur myself because it was such a big deal and it had been done. I mean, it is a genre in which there's, you know, multiple masterpieces already existing. So what would I think that I would add to it? And I guess one of the things that was going on, which sort of speaks to the wheelhouse of this podcast, is I felt as though Arthur were being quite de-romanticized. I felt as though we were getting a lot of rather hard-boiled, sort of noirish Arthurs, like the Arthur of The Winter King, the Bernard Cornwell, or the Charlie Hunnam Arthur from the movie. There was a move to kind of demystify Arthur in a way which I think is pretty cool. And if I were doing this, running Arthur 30 years ago, I probably would feel that pull as well, to kind of reground him in his historical reality. But contrary to what I said about 10 minutes ago, in this case, I felt as though what I really wanted was a romance Arthur. I wanted an Arthur with tons of magic and fairies. You know, people tend to take him back to the 6th century, which is where he would historically have lived, at a time when there were no castles and there were no knightly tournaments and there was no plate armor and streaming pennants and shields with, you know, coats of arms on them and all that lovely stuff. And it is way more historically accurate to do Arthur that way. But I felt as though he had been done that way so much lately that I wanted to move the other way. I remember reading that Aaron Sorkin had taken all the magic out of Camelot, the musical, when he kind of refurbished the book of that musical. And I thought, no, that's exactly wrong. It's exactly wrong. We should lean into the magicalness of Arthur and the romanticness of him, and do all the love stories and all the magic as much as we possibly can. So that was one of the impulses behind it, was to kind of re-enchant Arthur in this way that I felt like he was in line for. And the other part was the idea of writing about that period after Arthur's death, which had never really, no one's ever really told that story about what happens after Arthur dies. And of course, it is a bit silly to write a King Arthur story that has King Arthur dead in it. So, you know, there are probably half the book is flashbacks to when Arthur was alive. But this idea of that kind of broken world that existed after he died, where all the lights went out and nobody had any stars left to steer by, I found it so appealing, and it felt very modern to me. I feel like when you're writing Arthur, you need to find what is in that story that resonates with the world that you are in at this moment. And I felt like that collapse of the institutions that we trust and that shared sense of value, that was something that I recognized from what was happening right now, and it made the story meaningful in a new way to me. Plus the idea of bringing on the minor characters, writing about a time in the Arthurian timeline when most of the heroes are dead, so you can take these characters who have been the Rosencrantz and Guildensterns, you know, the people at the very edges of the story, and who aren't really even heroes, and bring them to the center of the stage and say, all right, now we're going to find out, are you a hero or are you not? That was a compelling story to me.
And you included some Latin, which is a romantic inclusion as well. Is it Latin a language that you already possessed a working knowledge of, or?
I definitely have taken Latin. I come from a family of Latin scholars, and I am by far the worst Latin scholar in the family. So any of my siblings are watching this, I can't really claim to have any mastery of Latin. But I did think that they ought to be speaking Latin, since they
Yeah.
would have seen themselves as kind of heirs to the Roman Empire. Um, so yes, love to have as much Latin as possible, and even a word or two of Brythonic, the old British language.
Mm-hmm. Very fitting.
The thing I was struck by that you were talking about when it comes to the Arthurian myth is this idea of what exists after this, where all the stories kind of take place. All the iterations that have come before have focused mostly on his life, but really looking at, yes, flashbacks, but also what happens after. And it feels like it keeps the conversation forward. Do you feel ever like when stories continue to be retold in different ways, like Cinderella or these other fairy tales, that they're not really pushing that conversation forward and we just kind of get caught up in that same rehashing?
Well, we're living in it's a great time for retellings. I mean, this idea of retelling stories. There's a great uh, book. Ava Reed, the new Lady Macbeth novel, is a good example. But there are so many good examples of interesting retellings that have been done recently. But I certainly, in the case of Arthur, I feel like one really has to earn it. You have to take the story and find a meaning that is buried in it, that has been there all along. Um, but and bring it to light in a way that that nobody else has before. And I think in the case of the Bright Sword, the most obvious one is just this idea of keeping the cameras rolling after Arthur dies. It's almost the definition of an Arthur story is that it ends when Arthur dies. The Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur, it says what's in there right on the tin. You're going to get Arthur dead, and that's going to be the end. And it's a terrible tragedy. But this idea of keeping the story going and looking at the people who have to live on after Arthur dies, and it becomes much more about surviving in this kind of almost post-apocalyptic world, and what you have to do to keep going in that world. The story becomes about that, which to me, I don't know, seemed like a powerful story that had been waiting for a long time to be told. When T.H. White wrote The Once and Future King, he was the first person to tell that story of Arthur's childhood, of the Sword and the Stone, with Merlin being Arthur's tutor and changing him into animals and teaching him life lessons and things like that. No one had ever done that before. T.H. White made up all that stuff, and he kind of filled in this area that on the map that had been blank all for 1,000 years of Arthur retellings. And I realized there was a big blank space in that world after he died. So why not scribble on it?
Absolutely.
Yep. The Sandra said the unsung hero stories are wonderful. Not only the knights, but Nimue and Morgan.
Yes. It's not original with me, the idea of looking at the female characters in the Arthurian world. Obviously, it was done very indelibly by the now canceled Marion Zimmer Bradley in Mists of Avalon. But it's one of those good ideas that you really can't do often enough, as looking at those characters. Especially, well, both of them are just incredibly rich, and it's almost like you look at them and they weren't built to be minor characters. Nimue overthrows Merlin and defeats him, and then goes to court and takes over his job. I mean, what a hero! What a great story that is. And Morgan Le Fay as well. She's obviously, if you think about what her story would be, if you told it from her point of view, it would be an unbelievable tragedy. in which Arthur would be just a minor and very unfortunate character. These people are so compelling, and they are in the classic Arthurian version. They're a little bit wasted. I think in the very early Arthurian stories, Morgan was actually quite interesting and not evil. She wasn't the villain. She was just somebody who had some. She was just really good at casting magic spells, and she was Arthur's half sister. She became kind of demonized in the high medieval period in a way that's really boring and unfortunate. So it seemed necessary to undo that a little bit in my version.
Mm-hmm. Did you find yourself seeking out other versions to see what other people were saying, or were you just I guess, did you bother to go seek out those other stories at all?
I spent a lot of time with the old versions. You know, the certainly Mallory and some of the French versions and the Chrétien de Troyes and some of the old Welsh versions, the oldest versions, which date back to before the turn of the first millennium. I spent a lot of time with those. I kind of I swore off some of the contemporary retellings that were coming out as I was writing the book, because I was worried that I would see somebody do something really cool, and then I would feel that I couldn't do it because they had done it. I thought I was better off not reading that stuff. But Arthur, it's one of those. It's one of those stories that has no proper canonical telling.
Yeah.
There are a million sort of refracted versions of it. It's like this incredible multiverse, and so I definitely spent a while, in exploring the Arthurian multiverse and finding different versions. There's, in some of the really early versions, the Old Welsh, in the Mabinogion, the Knights of the Round Table, each of them has a superpower. It's crazy, and almost it's kind of very Marvel. And so I borrowed a little bit to give some of the knights little magic powers, because I thought it was cool. And if anybody asked me about it, I could say, well, look, they did it in the Mabinogion, so it's super authentic.
Super authentic. That's right. Sandra also said the book flows so well, especially with the characters' backstories. With you writing it over 10 years, how hard was it to keep that flow and ensure that it melded together?
Oh, it's a good question. Again, lifting the veil in the very unromantic process of writing a novel. The truth is that I started by writing all those stories of the different characters, and the truth was that they didn't really meld together very well. They were all very separate, in that kind of, I don't know, sort of Chaucerian Canterbury Tales way, but I realized that I needed them to connect to each other, and to connect to the sort of present day story in a way that felt more organic. So a lot of the process of writing the book was finding connections and resonances between the different backstories of the characters. They all have this sort of story where they begin and they are in some way disempowered or excluded. Bedivere, for example, he only has one hand, and also he is gay, and he has to find his own path to feeling powerful and kind of owning who he is. And each of them has their own version of that arc. And I wanted them to feel like they were all part of the same world and bumping into each other and interacting and connecting with each other. And it took a while to make those connections.
It sounds like a very human-centric approach, or putting a lot of authenticity into the characters and not just writing them to serve some other larger plot.
I wanted to ignore the larger plot as much as possible. I mean, the great thing that T.H. White is sort of my major obsession as a Arthurian writer. The way that he gave them modern psychological novelistic personalities was so revolutionary, so incredible. No one had really done that before, and I wanted to kind of keep doing that. to build them out in this way, and just sort of make them be themselves, and make them be human beings, especially human beings whose stories, obviously they were gay knights on the round table. There's gay people in the NFL, there's gay people in the NBA, there's surely gay people on the round table, but nobody ever talks about it, what that would be like, feeling like you had to kind of disavow who you were all the time. It just seemed like such an important story that was sitting there waiting for somebody to write.
Yeah, absolutely not done before that I know of.
And not done to make a point, really, but more just to say, this is a human experience that assuredly happened, and let's talk about it. Let's think about what it would be like.
Yeah. It's giving light to something, and it's in a way it's challenging preconceived notions of, oh, it didn't happen until just modern times. No. Let's back that up. It actually did.
I remember writing in The Magicians, one of the characters in particular, Elliot, has this very fluid sexuality. He doesn't really identify necessarily as gay in a straightforward way, but most of his relationships are with other men. And I remember writing that into the story of The Magicians, without thinking about it at all. He was based on a person that I knew, with a kind of similar sexual profile. But when they came out, people pointed out that there weren't that many gay people in fantasy. I think there are a lot more now. This is 15 years ago. But I remember how much people responded to that kind of representation. And I feel as though in the Arthurian universe, I'd found a little corner of the fantasy universe that was so conservative and unreconstructed that it needed a little bit of someone had to let some light in there.
While it's not fantasy, years later, whenever Schitt's Creek came out, the conversation with David and Stevie standing in the wine, they're picking out some wines. That whole metaphor of he likes the wine and not necessarily the label on it, I felt like that was a nice parallel to the character that I got introduced to of Elliot.
Yeah, and if you watch the show, it's they did a very good job bringing the character from the books to the screen. It's very much the same person, to the point where now when I picture Elliot from the books, I can only picture that actor, Hale Appleman, who obviously I had Ken and Elliot when I wrote the books, but he has obliterated and taken over my personal Elliot and become my personal Elliot.
Funny how that works.
Yeah. I'm intrigued by Sandra's comment here, who, as she was reading it, she felt like Lancelot was the villain of your story, which, to your earlier comment, is just kind of exploring some of these potentially unexplored ideas. What is your take on that, and what is your take on Lancelot as a character in general?
Well, it's funny. I don't want to get too spoilery about the Bright Sword, and it's true that we look at a darker Lancelot than many of the Lancelots out there, which in retrospect I look back and think it's kind of a shame, because I love Lancelot. He's such a source of pathos. His story is one of my favorite stories in the Arthurian world, and yet when I came to write my own personal Lancelot, I found getting inside him, he's got to be a very strange and quite extreme personality. I mean, this is somebody who you look at, people who are at the very peak of physical performance, who have pushed themselves so hard that basically nobody can stand up against them. What inside that person would drive them in that way? It made me look around for what was motivating Lancelot.
His purpose, yeah.
And traditionally, it's his desire for, I don't know, for perfection, to become the chivalric ideal of a knight, and I appreciated that, and at the same time, um, I felt as though it was only half an answer. Um, and I almost want to go back and write another Arthurian version, which does a different Lancelot, because I love him so much. The story of Lancelot and Sir Ura, the Hungarian knight, who he heals as kind of the last miracle, basically, that he's allowed to do. It's probably my favorite Arthurian story. That and the story of Lancelot and Galahad. Um, this amazing thing where Lancelot sins with Elaine, and then from his sin comes the perfect knight who is everything that he thought that he would one day be. It's such an incredibly rich, sad story. And yet I didn't write it that way. I wrote it a different way. So I may have to write a second story, an alternate take, which goes into that. I don't know. There's so many stories inside that story, Arthur's story.
For me, that also kind of makes me think, when do you decide that a story is complete?
It's actually one of the hardest questions.
Mm-hmm.
As I frequently complain about, it took me 10 years to write The Bright Sword, which was a very long time to be writing any book, or really doing anything for 10 years. It's too long to be doing anything. And there were several points in the process where I thought I was done. And I would turn it in to my publisher, and they would say, no, it's not done. And so I needed other people to tell me that it wasn't ready yet. You really lose that ability to look at your own work and see what it means and what state it's in. I do remember writing the last finishing the last draft of it, and I was in Auckland, bizarrely enough, in New Zealand, somewhere I've never been before and have never been since. But I was in a hotel in Auckland, and I had a free morning, so I said, let's take a look at that last chapter, and see what we can do with it. And I remember finishing it and bursting into tears. I'm not a big crier. I don't cry that often, and so something in me realized that it was over, that I was finished. And it was definitely bittersweet, because then it was time to send the book out into the world. And who knows what's going to happen in that horrible place that we know as the world. I would have to take it off my hard drive and expose it to everybody's, I don't know, judgment and interpretation. For many years, it was just me and the book, and now it's sort of everybody's book. It was a bittersweet moment, definitely, but something in me, and I've struggled to verbalize it, but recognize that, okay, now it has become its own thing, and it doesn't need me to tinker with it anymore. But I don't know how I knew.
That's a great question. I feel like Emily and I kind of get to that same place of, we live with something for a long time, and then we finally put it out into the world, and then we're like, oh God, it's out there. Oh no.
Yep.
Oh boy.
It's a part of you. It's a part of your soul.
But it's different. It's different to know. It's difficult to know when the moment is. I certainly read novels sometimes where I think, this is as they say on the Great British Bake Off. It's it's underbaked or underproved. It needed one more going over, and nobody realized it at the time. I'm sure you've seen this as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's challenging because at a certain point, you don't get paid until the book is done, and then you turn it in, and then you get what they call in publishing an accepted manuscript, and that triggers a payment, and then it's published, and that triggers another payment. At a certain point, you're running out of money, and you need to turn it in because the real world is your children are asking for food, and you don't have any.
Right.
It's the real world is intruding and saying it has to be done, even though you're not sure if it's done or not. I don't know. It's a very tricky thing.
It's a balance when you have art that is somehow monetized. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, when I was working at Time, I had a salary, and then I got automatically. I went to the office, and they gave me a salary. I quit Time 8 years ago, and since then, I only get paid when I finish a work of art, and it does complicate things a little bit.
Certainly.
Well, I have really just two last questions because I know that we, um, oh, excuse me, I know that we are working against a deadline here. So I just have two last questions for you. Um, in your vast knowledge when it comes to the literary works, I am curious, is there a person, alive or dead, that you would like to have lunch with just to pick their brain? Who would it be?
I got stuck on vast knowledge when in the vast knowledge part of that question. I sadly I don't possess vast knowledge, but it is a good question. Who would it be? Um, those who are very familiar with the magicians probably would recognize that I have a bit of an Evelyn Waugh obsession. Brides Had Revisited is a book that he's a very romantic writer, Evelyn Waugh, very dark in his way. I think that he would be hilarious to have lunch with, and unbelievably smart. I don't think that Evelyn Waugh would like me. I think that
Oh.
he's a very judgmental person, and very caustic. Caustic isn't enough. He's quite mean with his humor, and yet I've always longed to know what it would be like to sit across the table from him.
Yeah.
He's the first person who comes to mind.
It would be an experience regardless.
Yeah, it would. He'd get really drunk, so it would be loose. It would be a loose lunch, definitely.
A loose lunch.
Well, still, I feel that is a great answer. And you never know, like he could come back and really enjoy your company. So I would
would love
not
to
put
think
past it. My other question for you is, I had asked you earlier about tips for making things more subtle and less info dumping, but now I'm going to gear it more towards those who are just getting into writing. What is one piece of advice that you wish somebody would have given you when you were younger that you're then going to turn around and give to new writers?
That's a good question. There's a few of them. I was a very slow learner as a writer. It wasn't. I'd been writing for 20 years before The Magicians came out, and that was my first hit. The first thing I wish somebody had said to me was, "It's all going to be okay."
Yeah.
If you think that you are a writer, if you think you're a writer, if you feel like there's something in here that belongs on a page, you're almost certainly correct. And if you keep at it long enough, it will come out. But it might take longer than you expect. But what else would I say? I would say experiment with cutting off the first 20 pages of your book, and you can probably start it later in the story than you think. I would urge myself to read everything aloud. I would urge myself to pay attention to my transitions. This is what I don't teach writing that often, but when I occasionally do, it's mostly me yelling at people to look at their transitions. Last sentence of each paragraph and the first sentence of the next paragraph. How do they relate to each other? Do they sync up? Do they flow one to the other in a way that makes it hard for people to stop reading? When I'm reading a writer who has good transitions, I know that I'm reading a professional writer who has their book is not underbaked. They've looked at it enough times. Somebody once said to me that the way a chapter works is that two things are happening at the same time, and at the end of the chapter, they connect. And I've invoked that to myself many, many times. It's not always true, but it's definitely a good way to think about a chapter. That's it. That's all the things I can think of, but I'm sure there are more.
That was well said.
Very well.
Yeah. Sorry, Trey.
Nope, I did not have
I was
anything
going to
else.
say, how can our audience best support you? I was thinking they should go to your website and follow your social media, and they should go buy your new book, The Bright Sword. But where are some places our audience can find you and support you?
You know, while The Bright Sword was coming out, I got very active on social media, and now I'm utterly burned out on social media. The one thing I probably keep up with is my Substack.
Okay.
which is at levgrossman.substack.com.
Okay.
That's probably, if you're looking to interact with me, that's probably where I'll be. Although I do also lurk on Blue Sky a fair amount. Yeah, that's probably your best bet.
Okay. Cool. I linked those in the chat for everybody. Good.
Awesome. Well, Lev, I have to say, I love your stance when it comes to the Arthurian myth. It's not one that I know very well, but I do look forward to getting to experience your version of that, and I look forward to hearing from our audience as they get to experience that as well. So, really, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you guys so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So please, everybody, go pick up your copy of The Bright Sword, wherever you can get, wherever fine books are sold or where you can acquire fine literature. Thank you for tuning in today. This episode, along with probably every other podcast, will be dedicated to Joe Capone, our moderator, fellow comedian, passionate encourager, and greatly missed friend. You can find us pretty much wherever you tune into podcasts. For updates, announcements, and more, follow us on social media under Modern Romantic. And we also have a Patreon. You can find us at TheModRom on Patreon. So if you want to get exclusive access to behind-the-scenes content, private conversations that we have recorded that are only available on Patreon, and other wonderful details, go check out our Patreon. Thanks, everybody. And it's all going to be okay.
Oh,
Have
yeah.
a great day.